He had not been touched in years, not an embrace, not a handshake, not the accidental graze of a stranger's arm in a crowded market, not the firm grip of a friend's hand on the shoulder, not even the casual, unconscious contact of ordinary human proximity, the kind that happens 100 times a day to people who live in the world and move through it freely. He had not been touched because his touch made you unclean, because his presence required warning, because the law he had grown up with, the law he still believed in, demanded that he keep a distance from the people who no longer considered him part of their world. He was a leper, and leprosy in the first century Jewish world was not merely a medical condition. It was a sentence, a social death that preceded whatever biological death eventually followed. It was the loss of everything that made a human life feel like a life. Community, family, worship, work, the ordinary fabric of days spent among people who knew your name. And on the morning this story begins, he broke every rule he was supposed to keep. He walked toward a crowd. He walked toward Jesus, and he knelt, and he said something so audacious, so precisely theological, so heartbreakingly honest, that it should stop everyone who reads it. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Not, can you heal me? Not, please help me. Not even the desperate, unqualified cry of a man who has given up on dignity. He said, if you are willing. He did not question the power. He only questioned whether the power would be turned in his direction. He had enough faith to believe Jesus could do it. He was not sure he deserved to have it done. And what Jesus did next, in front of the crowd, in broad daylight, without hesitation, is the reason this story has never stopped mattering. In the ancient world, the term the Bible translates as leprosy, tzara'at in Hebrew, lepra in Greek, covered a range of skin conditions that we might diagnose differently today. Modern biblical scholars note that it may have included what we now call psoriasis, vitiligo, certain fungal infections, and other skin disorders alongside what we clinically identify as Hansen's disease. The precise medical category matters less than the social reality the condition created. In Leviticus 13 and 14, the law of Israel addressed this condition in detail. If a person developed certain skin changes, they were brought to the priest, who examined them and made a determination. If the condition was declared tameh, unclean, the consequences were immediate and total. The person was required to tear their clothes, to leave their hair disheveled, to cover the lower part of their face. And wherever they went, they were required to call out, unclean, unclean, a warning, a declaration, an announcement to everyone within hearing that the person approaching was someone to be avoided. They could not live in a town. They lived outside the walls, in the places between settlements, in the margins of geography that corresponded to the margins of community. They could not touch or be touched. They could not enter the synagogue or the temple. They were excluded from every formal expression of the faith that was the center of Jewish identity. And if they developed this condition in childhood, if leprosy was, as the title of this story suggests, something they were born into or inherited from a parent, then they had never known anything else. The rules were not a change in their life. They were the only life they had ever had. This is the man who knelt before Jesus, not someone who had lost what they once had, but someone who had possibly never had it at all, who had grown up with the warning cry, the torn clothes, the mandatory distance, the face that people looked away from, and the presence that cleared a path, not from respect but from revulsion and the instinct for self-preservation. He had lived at the margins his entire life, and then he heard about Jesus. If this story is already reaching into something, if you know what it is to be treated as untouchable, as less than, as someone to be avoided rather than embraced, subscribe right now, because what happens next in this story is going to break something open in you. He would have known the risks of what he was doing. Going near a crowd was itself a violation of the rules. He was supposed to maintain distance, to warn, to stay in the margins where the margins had put him. Walking toward a group of people without calling out unclean. Unclean was the kind of thing that could get you driven back with stones. Not out of cruelty, out of fear, out of the instinct of self-protection that the law itself had validated. Out of the theology that said, this person is dangerous to your ritual purity, and purity is the currency of your relationship with God. He came anyway, and the crowd must have noticed him. The body that showed the signs, the posture of someone who had spent years learning to make themselves small, to move at the edges, to not take up more space than was absolutely necessary. And then the recognition of what they were looking at, and the instinctive reaction, the pulling back, the stiffening, the opening of a path that was not an invitation but a refusal. He walked through that parted crowd, past the faces that looked away, past the people who pulled their children close, past every silent, eloquent confirmation of what the world had decided about him. And he knelt at the feet of Jesus. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. This prayer contains entire volumes. Every word carries weight. Lord, he knew who he was talking to. He came with knowledge, with intention, with the specific focus of someone who has thought about this moment many times before arriving in it. If you are willing, he understood something profound. He was not questioning Jesus's power. He had heard enough. The healings in Capernaum, the teaching with authority, whatever had reached him in his exile, to believe the power was real. What he did not know was whether it would be directed towards someone like him, whether the rules that excluded him from the synagogue excluded him from this too, whether the distance between his condition and the normal world of grace was one that Jesus would be willing to cross. You can make me clean, not just heal. Clean. The word is specific and loaded. Katharizo, to purify, to cleanse, to restore to a state of ritual acceptability. He was not only asking to be healed of a physical condition, he was asking to be restored to the community, to the worship, to the life that had been inaccessible to him from the beginning. He was asking for the whole of what the disease had taken, or had never allowed him to have. He knew exactly what he needed. He just wasn't sure he was allowed to ask for it. Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Before he said a word, before any declaration, any assessment, any determination of worthiness or procedure or proper process, he stretched out his hand and he touched the man who had not been touched in years, possibly in his entire life, in any meaningful sense. This is the most radical physical act in this entire account, and it requires slowing down to be fully felt. In touching this man, Jesus became ritually unclean. Under the law, Contact with a leper transferred the impurity from the leper to the one who made contact. Every observant Jew in that crowd would have understood this instantly. Every Pharisee who was watching, and they were always watching, filed it away. A rabbi touching a leper in public. But here is what the Gospels make clear about this encounter, and about every healing encounter in Jesus' ministry. The contamination did not flow in the expected direction. In a world where the unclean always contaminated the clean, Jesus operated by a different principle entirely. His cleanness was not vulnerable to the man's uncleanness. His purity was not threatened by the contact. Instead, the holiness moved in the other direction. The cleansing flowed from him toward the man. The touch was not just compassion. It was a demonstration that the logic of contamination had been overturned, that there was a source of purity so deep and so stable that it could touch what was unclean and remain itself while making the other thing new. And then he spoke. "I am willing. Be clean." 3 words. 2 in Aramaic, probably, even shorter than the English translation. But let the first 2 land. I am willing. The answer to the question that the man had not been sure he was allowed to ask. The direct, unhesitating, unambiguous response to the only uncertainty the man's faith had left room for. He had believed the power was real. He had not known if it would reach him. I am willing. It reaches you. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. The word immediately, euthys in the Greek, runs through the Gospel of Mark like a drumbeat. Things happen immediately, not gradually, not over the course of a treatment period, not with the incremental improvement that even the best medicine produces. The leprosy was there, and then it was not. What does a man feel when that happens to his skin? When what has been visible and marked and carrying all the social weight of his exile simply changes? When he looks at his hands and sees what they look like, what they actually look like, the underlying texture of clean, unmarked skin, perhaps for the first time. He had probably looked at his hands every day, with the particular involuntary attention of someone whose condition is written on their body. He had watched the progression or the stability of the disease, noted the places where it had spread or held. He had probably stopped letting himself look directly at certain areas because looking too closely was too much. And now he looked, and it was gone. We do not have words for what that moment feels like from the inside. The gospel does not try to give us them. It simply says, immediately, his leprosy was cleansed, and lets the reader carry the weight of what that means for a human being who has lived the life this man lived. Comment below right now. Is there something you have been living with for so long that you've stopped believing it could change? Something written on your life the way the leprosy was written on this man's skin? Tell us. Because the next part of this story carries something directly for you. Jesus healed him, and then did something that has puzzled readers for 2,000 years. He told him not to tell anyone. See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. Why the secrecy? Why, after a public miracle performed in front of a crowd, did Jesus instruct the man to keep quiet about it? The instruction about showing himself to the priest is clear enough. The Levitical law required that a person who had been healed of leprosy go through a specific process of priestly examination and declaration before they could be readmitted to the community. They needed the official sign-off, the formal restoration. Without that process, even a healed man remained socially and religiously excluded because the system required an authorized determination. Jesus was not replacing the system. He was completing the healing by directing the man toward the process that would restore him to community. The physical healing was one thing. The social and religious restoration required the priest. But the silence instruction, the tell no one, that is more complex. The simplest explanation is that Jesus understood what public attention would cost him at this stage of his ministry. The more his fame spread, and it was already spreading rapidly, the more difficult it became to operate. Mark's gospel confirms this. The man told everyone anyway, and as a result, Jesus could no longer openly enter a town. He had to stay in desolate places, and people came to him from everywhere. The man's disobedience of the silence instruction made the ministry harder. But there may be something else in the instruction, something that was, in its own way, a gift rather than a restriction. Because the man who had been required to announce his own uncleanness everywhere he went, who had been required by law to make himself known as a contaminated person, to precede himself with the warning cry, to define himself to every stranger he ever encountered by the single most limiting fact about his condition. This man was now being told to go quietly, to go through the proper channels, to show up as a person navigating a process, not as a spectacle or a story. He was being given, perhaps, the experience of moving through the world without having to announce his history to everyone he met first. He didn't keep the silence. The gospel is honest about that. He told everyone. The joy was too large to contain. The restoration was too complete to hold in. But the instruction had been offered. Jesus touched a leper in front of witnesses, in daylight, without ceremony or hesitation or any of the distancing mechanisms that the religious culture had built around that kind of contact. He stretched out his hand and he touched the man who had been told his whole life that he was not to be touched. And that touch, that specific singular physical act of contact, has been the image that this story sends out into the world more than any other. Because the healing could have happened differently, the centurion's servant was healed at a distance. The paralyzed man was healed through words spoken from across a room. Jesus had options. He could have said, "Be clean," from where he stood, and the leprosy would have left, and the man would have been healed, and the story would have been remarkable. But he touched him, and the touching is not incidental. It is the theology of this story embodied in a gesture. Because what leprosy had done, what the law, operating within the limits of its own logic, had done, was create a world in which a category of human being was defined primarily by their untouchability. A world in which the most basic, primal, fundamental human connection, skin to skin, the physical acknowledgement that another person exists and matters, was systematically withheld. Jesus refused to heal from a safe distance what a touch could heal from close, not because the distance would have been insufficient to cure the disease, but because the disease was not only in the skin, it was in the 12 years or 20 years or however many years of not being touched. It was in the face that people looked away from. It was in the mandatory distance and the warning cry and the accumulated weight of being told by every mechanism the world had available that you did not count. The touch addressed what the word alone could not reach. And this is why, across 2,000 years, in every culture and every circumstance that has produced its own versions of the untouchable, the outcast, and the stigmatized, and the person defined by a condition that the world has decided makes them less than, this story keeps arriving. Because every generation has its lepers. Every generation has its specific mechanisms for creating people who are warned against and kept at a distance and touched last, if at all. And into every generation, this story sends the same image. A hand stretching out, making contact, not flinching, remaining exactly itself while making the other thing clean. The title of this story names what the leprosy was carrying: societal prejudice and discrimination. And it is worth naming it directly. The man in this account was not merely sick. He was socially condemned by a system that had, with genuine theological sincerity, built a world in which certain kinds of human bodies were categorized as dangerous and excluded on that basis. The system was not trying to be cruel. It was trying to manage ritual purity in a world that did not have modern medicine and used physical categories to approximate spiritual realities. But the effect on the person at the center of it, whatever the intention of the architects of the system, was dehumanizing. Leprosy in the ancient world was the template for a pattern that has repeated itself in human history in forms that do not involve leprosy at all. The basic structure is recognizable. A category of person is identified. A set of characteristics is assigned to that category, and on the basis of those characteristics, the person is excluded from full participation in the life of the community, kept at a distance, required to announce themselves as other, defined primarily by the characteristic that separates them from the norm rather than by the full complexity of who they are. The form changes, the category changes, the characteristics shift with culture and era and the particular fears of a given society. But the structure, the distancing, the mandatory otherness, the systematic withholding of ordinary human contact, that structure has always been with us. And into that structure always the same question: is someone willing to reach out and touch? Not metaphorically, not in the safe abstract sense of expressing solidarity from a comfortable distance, but actually crossing the space that the structure has built and making contact with the person on the other side of it. Jesus was willing, more than willing. He reached first. He did not wait for the man to touch him. He stretched out his hand. I am willing, be clean. The willingness preceded the word. The touch preceded the healing. The act of reaching across the distance came before the formal declaration that things were now different. This is the model. This is the thing that this story is putting into the world and leaving there for every generation to find. Somewhere in first century Galilee, a man who had been untouchable his whole life walked into the presence of the priest, clean, not almost clean, not in process, clean. The skin that bore the testimony of his healing was the evidence the priestly examination required. The examination was made. The declaration was given. And whatever ancient process of readmission followed, the offerings, the washing, the formal restoration of status, he went through it. And then he went home, or wherever home was, for a man who had perhaps spent his whole life outside the walls of ordinary living. Wherever the first place was that he could enter without calling out his own contamination. Wherever the first room was, where he was not a hazard, but a person. We do not know what that looked like. The gospel does not follow him. He received his healing and his instruction, and he went, telling everyone, the text says, which means the story spread through whatever region this happened in like water through thirsty ground. The man who had been required to announce his uncleanness everywhere he went was now announcing the opposite, not by law, but by joy. Not required, but incapable of keeping it in. He could not keep quiet about what had happened to him. And that telling, that irrepressible, overflow testimony of a man who had been touched after years of being untouchable, reached enough people that it found its way into 2 Gospels and has been in the stream of human testimony for 20 centuries. Because every generation that has ever had its untouchable people has needed to hear this story, has needed to hear that the holiness moves in the other direction, that the one with enough purity and enough love and enough willingness can reach into the contaminated space without being contaminated by it, can make contact, can say, "I am willing," and can mean it in a way that reaches the full depth of what is needed. You may have been the leper in this story. You may know what it is to have a characteristic, visible or invisible, physical or historical, something inherited or something acquired, that the world has decided makes you keep a distance. That has generated its own form of warning cry, its own version of the mandatory announcement of your otherness. You may know what it is to move through spaces where people subtly redirect, or to wonder whether any grace being distributed in the room will find its way to where you are. The hand reached for the man who thought he might not be eligible. The hand reaches for you. If you are willing, you can make me clean. And the answer that came back, the answer that has been reverberating through this story for 2,000 years, reaching into every form of exile and exclusion that human life produces, is the same answer it has always been. I am willing, be clean. If this story touched something in you today, if the hand reaching across the distance reached somewhere in you that needed reaching, please share this video with one person who needs to hear that they are not untouchable. Leave a comment below. Tell us your leprosy, not literally, but the thing that has made you feel like you needed to keep a distance, or like the world kept its distance from you. Tell us the moment the hand reached across. Comment, "I am willing." If this story is calling you to be the hand for someone in your own life, and subscribe, because every story in this series is about the moment grace travels across the distance, that fear built and changes everything on the other side. The hand is still reaching. It always was.